So today is Veterans Day, and one of my patrons requested that I review a movie specifically for Veterans Day. And the movie for me that comes to mind the most when I think about veterans is the movie First Blood. It's the first movie in the Rambo franchise, and so a little bit of the message of it and the meaning behind it and the historic context of the film gets lost because of how ludicrous the sequels were. Because in the second movie, he goes back to and wins the Vietnam War. Then he goes to Afghanistan and beats the Russians, and then goes to Burma and beats the Burmese. And it became like these revenge war fantasy type movies where it becomes like this superhero, epic, legendary type character. But the starting point for the franchise, the first film, has much more grounded roots. It's still an action movie. It's still a thriller, but it was grounded much more in a historic context with a more realistic type story. So by the chance, if you haven't seen the movie, essentially the plot of it is Sylvester Stallone, this guy right here, maybe my favorite actor, plays John Rambo, a Vietnam vet who's essentially homeless and lost. Doesn't really know what to do with his life, and he's trying to reconnect with all of his old war buddies and try and find them. And he finds his way into a small town where he's not welcome. They don't want him to eat there. They don't want him to stay there. And the sheriff essentially tries to run him out of town, and he just decides to stick it to him, tries to walk back into the town, and therefore he gets arrested. And while he's arrested, the police officers are kind of rough him up a little bit. But the problem is that he's struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, and it doesn't necessarily know that. He doesn't just have that language, but very clearly something's wrong with him. And at least one of the police officers knows something's wrong with the guy, but they just kind of keep pushing him, and they try to shave him up. And so they're trying to force him, and he's being belligerent, but they're trying to force him violently to do things. And at a certain point in time in his mind, he just starts snapping and flashing back to being a POW in Vietnam, where he was actually tortured, and essentially he just snaps in his brain and just starts beating up the cops and escapes. Well, if you punch cops, beat up cops, and run for it, even though he didn't kill anybody, you don't get to punch cops, so they start chasing him. And in the scenario of chasing him, someone does end up dying, and therefore the police are in full revenge mode trying to catch this guy. But he's just a guy that has actual post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and they pushed him. They made him snap and created a scenario, and that's the central conflict of the movie. Now, before I start diving into my full thoughts on it, why it's the movie I decided to talk about on Veterans Day, I want to, as I said before, this was a movie recommended, or the concept of reviewing a day for Veterans Day was one recommended by one of my patrons over Patreon. If you don't know what Patreon is, essentially it's the #1 way that you can support my channel. Over there, you can directly financially support us, and in exchange for that, you gain different perks depending on how much you give. There's exclusive content. You get to recommend content for my channel, like this video you are watching right now is only happening because of a patron. Be Wise requested that I do something of this nature, and that's where it's coming from. So if you enjoy my channel, if you want to help me continue doing what I'm doing, if you want some extra input, some exclusive content, post 3 or 4 videos per week that are exclusive just to them. So if that's interests you, please consider supporting me over there. All right, with that said, let's kind of dive into this movie. And the reason that this movie for me is the movie that comes to mind for when I think veterans, that it comes to mind, is because it so captures a moment in time and a piece of history that we lose a little bit if you're like my age or younger, which is to say I was born in 1981. So Vietnam War ended 8-ish years before I was born. And so I obviously had nothing to do with it. But a lot of people my dad's age, my dad did not serve. I think that, I don't remember all the details. It doesn't matter. I don't have a story there. But he didn't serve. But some of my friends' dads did serve in Vietnam. Some of them were drafted. They didn't even volunteer. They were drafted and served in a war that was very unpopular, that we didn't really win, somewhat like the Iraq War from 10 years ago. Except people were drafted for it. They were forced to serve in the military, and then they came back, and the culture at the time in many ways blamed the soldiers. They pointed fingers at the soldiers and spit at the soldiers for this war that some of them didn't volunteer to serve in. They didn't want to, and it broke them. And I specifically remember one of my good friend's dads from when I was in 5th, 6th, 7th grade. His dad had served in Vietnam, and I believe he was a helicopter pilot. And I remember having dinner at their house, and I think I was very churchy growing up. I'm still very churchy. And in some context that came up, and he started talking about war and just the things he saw there and things he did. And it just really struck me. I mean, this was 25 years ago that this conversation happened. The weight of that he was just carrying 20 years after this war, and it had done something to him. And it was right around the same time I would have seen First Blood for the first time, and wouldn't have put all the pieces together and put it together now. But at the time, as a culture, we treated veterans incredibly poorly. And we didn't respond appropriately, and we didn't point fingers appropriately as to who's responsible for the war. And that's a problem. And we're much better now. The people very vehemently disagree with a lot of the stuff going on in the war, or Iraq war, and things like that going on. But we pointed fingers at politicians, which is the correct place to point our fingers and things like that, not at the soldiers that are actually serving. And so this movie captures a lot of that in what goes on in the story of you've got a guy that was very broken by a war that he served in and the reaction to him when he came back. And the whole monologue, and some people make fun of it because he's incomprehensible, but that's the whole point. He's broken. This guy that is the toughest guy on earth is emotionally empty and destroyed. And this guy that is a world-class killer, world-class soldier, can't function anymore in society because of what happened to him, because of all the things about it. Even though he's the best at something, back in normal life, he just does not function there and doesn't know how to interact with people anymore. And that's very compelling. And it gets lost, as I said at the beginning, because of just how legendary and epic, and he's the soldier that can win the Vietnam War by himself and take on an army. He is the one-man army. That's where it goes. But in the first movie, it has that in it, but the way the context of it is he is a former Green Beret trained in jungle combat, and he's in the woods taking on a small town police force. And so then they come after him. They don't know what they're doing. And then they kind of bring in kind of local militia sort of things. And it's all kind of local. It's not trained soldiers. It's people that own guns. It's people used to giving up parking tickets and running off vagrants, as what kind of happens in this movie. And in that context, he's able to best them, and because he has the skills of jungle combat and outthink them and maneuver them, because that's what his thing is, and they're just police soldiers. It's not what you see in the future movies where he takes on actual soldiers with machine guns. Those are two different categories, and that's what makes this movie head and shoulders better than the previous movies in the series, and an interesting exploration of ideas of a point in time. There's been some rumors they're going to remake First Blood, and there's constantly been rumors for a while that they were going to do a Rambo 5 with Stallone, or a TV show with Stallone, or a prequel series with all sorts of stuff. So as of about a year ago, they said that they were going to do a new, updated, rebooted Rambo, and there's actually a rebooted Bollywood Rambo coming out very shortly, but maybe it's even already out. And all those seem very off to me because the nature of the story of Rambo is so tied specifically to Vietnam and the cultural response to it, and the way he would have been treated by society. One of the ideas that's in the book, First Blood, because the movie's based off a book that it doesn't translate, it's not as clearly stated in the movie, but it can be implied in the movie, is that the sheriff in the town, played by Brian Dennehy, is a veteran of the Korean War. So he had served himself, came back, got a job, well-adjusted. He's an okay guy. And he was part of a war that kind of forgotten, because people talk about World War II and there's strong feelings on that. And then people talk about the Vietnam War and there's strong memories about that. But between those two, very right there in the middle of it, was this thing called the Korean War that wasn't as long and as either as accepted and valued like the World War II, or as rejected as the Vietnam War. It was just kind of the thing that happened. And so he felt like he'd been in a war that people had forgotten about. He's like, I'm a veteran too. And I'm okay. Like, why? And that was kind of the undertones of some of the rivalry back and forth between the two of them in the book. That's, you can, if you know that, you can see it in the movie, but it's not stated in the movie. And those sorts of elements are just what makes the movie fascinating to me, and one that I think a lot more people need to revisit it in light of its cultural context and the history that it's actually presenting. Because I was born after all this. I was born right around when this movie came up. And so in that, have a different, I don't know how accurate, true, I don't know exactly how veterans entirely resonate with it, but given that it was a hit movie that led to the second movie that was a gigantic hit movie, pretty sure veterans connected with it. And a lot of people resonated with these stories because of the way veterans were treated. And that's very much so why I wanted to talk about it today. So talking about my normal good and bad as I normally do in my reviews, obviously it's just a tense thriller that's captivating because of these characters, the scenario, everything I've talked about thus far. It's handled pretty well. You can see the action, but it's not like super choreographed slick stuff, but it shouldn't be. It shouldn't come off like that. It comes like a guy that knows jungle combat, sneaking up on people, doing little maneuvers to outsmart people, setting traps in a great sequence in the movie where he does all of that. But I think part of also what makes it good is what I mentioned before of there's legitimate, as we were watching the story, you understand why the police officer would first arrest him. You understand why Rambo would buck back at him. You understand each of these things along the way and how the misunderstanding of they don't understand what PTSD is. They don't understand who they're dealing with. They don't understand how serious some of this stuff is. And the way they're treating him is going to set him off. They don't understand what they're about to do and that it's a ticking time bomb as soon as they start behaving the way they're behaving. And that creates for interesting tension. And then once things get going, he's snapped. He's legitimately kind of crazy as soon as he snaps. It shows what's going on in his head and with the flashbacks and stuff. And he snaps. And so they're treating him like a guy that's on a murder spree, and he's not. He's a guy that they brutalized, they mistreated because he was pushing back, and that's both sides creating tension and conflict. That's what makes for good storytelling. And so when a guy that actually goes out of the line and starts shooting at him to try and kill him, he's crossed the line. Rambo picks up a rock to defend himself, throws a rock, and this leads to a character falling to his death and dying. Rambo hasn't really, that's not actually an immoral action at that point in time because a police officer shouldn't be shooting at him based off the laws of the land and what you can and can't do. And so he doesn't actually do something that would cause him to be shot at. But what he does kills someone, so a police force naturally goes into all of this is good tension and actually crafting a story that's interesting, captivating, and you can understand fully why both sides are doing what they're doing. You understand fully why everything's going on. And all in the context that's socially relevant and important and historically significant. On the bad side, it's a movie that's got some significant issues in a few parts. All in the middle. So the setup of the movie's good, kind of the payoff at the end where it doesn't turn into a big, like, he's mowing down the police officers and there's hundreds of them. You can't do that. But it gives a finale that comes to an emotional climax if you want his anger, rage about this mistreatment and everything going on to have a payoff. And so he blows up a gas station and stuff like that. Maybe he kills the sheriff. I mean, I don't know how clear that is at the end if he killed the sheriff or not. But it gives a payoff. But really, it's an emotional payoff where you have the colonel there and they have the kind of this breakdown where they discuss things, understand where things are headed, and you have that moment where you get him to articulate the feelings that he had and maybe so many other people were feeling that leads for emotionally satisfying conclusions. The beginning's good, end's good. Trautman's amazing, Stallone's amazing, Brian Dennehy's amazing. In the middle, it struggles, starting with as soon as Rambo runs into the cave. There's this scene that even on the commentary, Stallone makes fun of it, where he calls it the F-Truth scene where the National Guard shows up and they pull out a bazooka and they're like joking around, shoot the bazooka. It's this weird kind of wacky humor scene. Same, as soon as he gets out of it, he starts driving down the road and cracks some jokes. He's like, you should watch the road. That's dangerous. I don't remember what the line is. He cracks some joke that's a little bit like, what? That seems out of place for this movie. So there's a couple lines that feel out of place. And it drags a little bit in the middle there when he's in the cave and they think he's dead. And so there's some conversations with Trautman and the sheriff about what's kind of going on and the tensions that led to it. There aren't bad scenes, but it just, you can feel the momentum kind of go down a little bit as it gets to that. And pulls a little bit out when you have so many out of tone scenes with the F-True bazooka scene and then the car ride, seatbelt joke. So out of place for the movie that you're watching. And then because it slows down, each time I watch, I'm like, yeah, the brakes do kind of go on here and it slows down a little bit. But overall, a very good movie. If you haven't seen it, you need to check it out. It's action thriller, very much thriller at parts. It's not the later movies where it's just him with a machine gun mowing down guys. It's not like, if you've only seen John Rambo, the fourth one, where he's in the back of the truck blowing guys away. That's not what this movie is at all. Much more him in the woods being hunted by them, and then him hunting them, and then pulling out the dogs, and then him in a cave, and stuff like that, and cool monologues about how epic he is. If I had to give a rating to this one, I give it a 9 out of 10. It's a very solid, good movie. You need to go see it. Almost could have been that 9.5 best of type stuff, almost there, but because of some of that stuff in the middle and the pacing issues with it, it pulls it back a good bit of the viewing experience of the movie. Because it's not like it's a long movie where you can understand the pacing slowing down. It's a pretty tight movie that still feels like, why are we slowing down? And if I'm being honest, if you haven't seen this one, what are you watching this review for? Go pick up this box set over here, buy it, watch it. It's a very cool movie, especially if you're younger and don't know about culture and the way Vietnam vets were treated. Watch it in light of that context, and particularly for Veterans Day, it's one you check out and think about it, and that the way we treat veterans is much better than it used to be, I think, as best I can tell. I'm not a history major, and I'm not a veteran myself, but to my knowledge, we are. So there you go. There's my take on it, my Veterans Day thoughts. What's your thoughts on First Blood? Tell me down below in the comment section. I'd love to hear your take on it. I love these movies. I like this Stallone fellow. Love to talk about his movies with you down in the comment section. If you're new to my channel, please consider clicking that subscribe button. I do movie reviews, TV reviews, patron recommended selections, or at least topics to discuss, ranking videos. I should have another one coming up tomorrow, but the key thing is I don't want to just talk about movies. I want to talk about movies with you. So join me in the comment section, and thank you so much for watching.